William J. Collins, Jr., Lieutenant, United States Naval Reserve. In my time, I was born in 1941, you were going to be drafted, period, if you were healthy. There was no draft number, there was nothing. If you were healthy, you were going to go into service. I graduated from college in 1964, and as a junior at the College of William and Mary, I had taken a naval officer candidate course or test that some recruiter on campus had offered, and 3 of us took it. And we were college students, we promptly forgot it. Okay, we're done. And it went to BUPERS or where the Bureau of Naval Personnel or somewhere, and then I went on and graduated from college, and it was difficult to get a job in that time frame because everybody knew if you were healthy you were going to go into service, and they didn't want to be bothered with training you for this particular job and you're going to be leaving. So the only job I could get was through my mother's association with the Virginia Parole Board. And she was a social services officer in Sussex County, Virginia. And the parole board offered me a position, which I took. I started off as a parole officer trainee. So that was in July of '64, and I served in that capacity at the main penitentiary in Richmond, Virginia, which does not exist now, and was living in a boarding house and in South Richmond. And I got a telephone call from my mother. The social services office, that's the funny part of the story, social service office was right next to the selective service office at Sussex Courthouse. My mother and the selective service lady were tombstone buddies, good friends. I'm sorry, that's slang, but you understand what I mean. And so when Lucille Herbert, her boss, and my mother were at lunch with Ms. Simmons, the selective service lady, she said, your son's letter's going out today. She called me on the phone. I went straight to Broad Street, Richmond, across the street from Main Street Terminal, next door to the Julian's Restaurant, which was where the U.S. Navy Recruiting Center was. And I went in, they sent me upstairs, I talked to a lieutenant, and I asked him the simple question. I took a test at William and Mary that qualified me to be a naval officer. Can you find it? He picked up the phone, and in less than 2 minutes, he had all of my information. And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, my selective service letter is on the way to my house in Waverly, Virginia. I want to sign up right now. And that was the beginning of my naval service. I did not want to go in the Army. My father had spent all of his service career in the Army, away from home. As I said, I was born in 1941, and he came home in '45, and that was the first time I remembered seeing him. So I decided it was better to do that and not have to worry about it. Little did I know that when the Navy deployed, they were gone at least 6 months or more. So, but anyway, that's another story. I joined the Navy, got a commission, and served on the Second Fleet Command Ship USS Newport News. I left communication school and reported aboard the Newport News in September of 1967, 1965. And it was in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in dry dock. And it was scaffolding, and it was everything that you could imagine, just like the Capitol in Washington, D.C. right now. It's stuff all around it, trying to get it back right. And the first thing I did was to walk down and walk underneath the ship and see those 4 shafts and 4 screws coming out from that vessel, knowing that's 120,000 shaft horsepower that I'm looking at. And that's pretty awesome. And as I said earlier, the ship was 717 feet long in dry dock. It'd take you a little while to walk down the length of that ship. And the aircraft carriers today are like 1,000 feet, so there wasn't that much difference. And of course, our aircraft carries 90,000 tons versus 21, but that was my first impression. And then when we went aboard, oftentimes they would ask you to go find a motel room because they might be working where your berthing space was going to be. And those of us who stayed aboard, and some of us did, the noise contingent was pretty significant because they always were working 24 hours a day. They were working on that ship. But that was my first impression because she was sitting there. And the guns were apart as nearly as you can imagine, and because the steel turrets were still there, and the 5-inch 38s were sitting on deck, and some of them were off and being serviced and some weren't. As a clarification, I'm sure people that look at this interview will understand that, but a turret goes down 6 decks, and when the gun turns, the whole turret turns inside the ship. Ammunition handling room is at the bottom, and the gun is at the top. And chain hoists are on the bottom. You put a shell casing here and a powder casing here, and they go up like this into the gun. The Salem class cruiser was the very first one to use brass casings and not silk bags for powder. And there was a check sight observer that sat up top. The ammunition handlers were down below. It was about 20 of them. And their job was to load that ammunition and get it up. The Newport News could put 90 rounds of 8-inch ammunition in the air before the first one hit the ground. That's how good they were. As a sidelight, can I tell this? The check sight observer is usually a commissioned officer, junior officer, whose job it is to advise the gun operator that the gun can be fired safely at the last second before the gun is actually fired. That means he's looking down the check sight to make sure that the field is clear to where the gun's going to be fired. The check sight observer on the forward 8-inch 50 on the Newport News was a very good friend of all of ours. He's a really nice guy. And he had one problem, and that was that he would get seasick if you just talked about it. And you could single up, well, that's another story, but when you're in port, your lines are doubled up in case there's a storm or something like that. When you single up the lines, they would always tease him, well, it's time for him to get sick. and so his crew knew that. And he was terrible for being teased. And I told you it was 6 decks down. They would take a milk pail and put it at the bottom of that deck, that 6 decks down. He's up there at the top in the check sight observer's seat. And they would holler up to him, and I can't remember his name right this second, but he said, okay, sir, okay, right here, here's where you go. So that if he had to barf, that's where he barfed. So that's just another story. But it was a magnificent ship. It had 2 different kinds of plates in the boiler that could be used. In combat, you could put special boiler plates online that would exceed the speed that the ordinary speed of the ship would allow. But the Newport News could do 35 knots in a heartbeat. And when you're talking about a ship that big doing 35 knots and greater if you were in a combat situation. And later she was, because she served in Vietnam beginning at some of the same time that I was there, in the Gulf of Tonkin and further north. In fact, was involved in an operation in one of the major harbors in North Vietnam.